The night I told my family I was leaving the restaurant for good, my older brother laughed, actually laughed, right there in the middle of the kitchen and said, "You'll be back in a month. You always come crawling back." 6 months later, it was my mother's number lighting up my phone at 11 at night, her voice shaking in a way I had never heard before, asking if there was any way I could come by and just take a look at the books. Hey everyone, welcome back to Silent Family Stories. If you're new here, this channel is about the quiet moments inside families, the ones that build up slowly over years before finally reaching a breaking point. If that kind of story speaks to you, go ahead and hit subscribe now because there's a lot more of this coming your way. All right, let's get into it. My family ran a small restaurant, the kind of place that had been open for a couple of decades by the time I'm telling you about, built originally by my grandparents and eventually passed down to my parents. It wasn't fancy, but it had a loyal group of regulars, the kind of place where people knew the servers by name and ordered the usual without needing to look at a menu. I started working there when I was 14, technically too young for most paid positions. But family businesses tend to operate by their own set of rules. At first, it was small tasks, rolling silverware, wiping down tables, the kind of light work that felt almost like a normal part of growing up in a family like mine. As I got older, my responsibilities grew steadily, until by the time I was in my early 20s, I was essentially running significant parts of daily operations, scheduling staff, managing inventory, handling a good chunk of the bookkeeping that kept the whole place financially afloat. Here's the part of this story that I think matters most, the part that took me far too long to fully recognize for what it was. Despite handling responsibilities that, at any other business, would have come with a proper management salary, I was paid a fraction of what that role was actually worth, framed consistently by my parents as simply helping out the family, with vague promises that things would even out eventually, that my contributions would be recognized and rewarded once the business stabilized a bit more. That, eventually, never quite arrived. Year after year, there was always some new reason, a slow season, an unexpected repair, a family member going through a hard time who needed extra support. I understood those reasons, at least individually, and each time, I told myself it was reasonable to keep being patient, to keep prioritizing the family business over building anything more secure for myself. Meanwhile, my two older brothers, both of whom worked outside jobs unrelated to the restaurant, seemed to exist in a completely different financial reality within our family. When one of them needed help with a down payment on a house, my parents found a way to help. When the other wanted to go back to school for an advanced degree, tuition assistance appeared without much hesitation. When I mentioned, gently, more than once over the years, that I could really use some support saving for my own future outside the restaurant, the conversation always seemed to circle back to how much the family business needed me right now, how selfish it would feel to prioritize my own plans over something that supported the whole family. I want to be fair here, because I think it matters. My parents weren't cruel people in any obvious, easily identifiable way. They worked incredibly hard themselves, often putting in longer hours than anyone else at that restaurant. I genuinely believe they loved me. But somewhere along the way, a pattern had quietly solidified within our family, one where my labor, my time, my career potential had become something the family simply relied on without ever fully acknowledging its actual value, financially or otherwise. By the time I turned 28, something in me had finally reached its limit. I had spent almost 14 years of my life, most of my adult working years up to that point, essentially subsidizing a business that, while it supported the family, had never adequately supported me in return. I had watched friends my age build savings, buy homes, take vacations, while I remained financially stretched thin, still living in a small apartment I could barely afford on what the restaurant paid me, despite the significant responsibility I carried there. I remember the conversation where I finally told my family I intended to leave. We were in the kitchen after close, the way most serious family conversations at that restaurant tended to happen, once the customers were gone and it was just us cleaning up for the night. I explained as calmly and clearly as I could manage that I needed to build a life and a career that could actually support my own future, that I loved them and loved the restaurant, but that I couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability indefinitely for a business that had never fully valued what I contributed to it. My father mostly listened in silence, his expression difficult to read. My mother looked hurt, immediately worried about how they would manage without me handling so much of the daily operations. And my older brother, the one who had never worked a single shift at that restaurant in his entire adult life, laughed, actually laughed, and made that comment about me coming crawling back within a month, as though this decision was some impulsive tantrum rather than the result of 14 years of quiet, accumulated frustration. I gave the family a reasonable amount of notice, roughly 2 months, to help them find and train someone to take over the responsibilities I had been handling, wanting to leave things in a genuinely manageable state rather than walking away abruptly out of spite. During those final weeks, I trained a newly hired manager as thoroughly as I could, documented processes I had built informally over the years, tried to set things up for as smooth a transition as possible. Leaving that restaurant was one of the hardest and most liberating decisions of my life, honestly holding both of those truths at the same time. I took a position at a company completely unrelated to the restaurant industry, starting at a level that reflected my actual experience for the first time in my working life, rather than the informal, undervalued role I had occupied within my family's business for so many years. The first few months after leaving were a strange mixture of relief and lingering guilt, the kind of guilt that doesn't disappear just because a decision is objectively reasonable. I still worried about the restaurant, still found myself checking in occasionally, though I tried to maintain the boundaries I had worked so hard to establish for myself. From what I understood through occasional conversations with my mother during those months, the newly hired manager, while competent enough in some respects, simply didn't have the same depth of institutional knowledge I had built up over 14 years. The kind of knowledge that isn't easily transferred through a couple months of training, no matter how thorough that training might be. Small inefficiencies started accumulating, scheduling conflicts, inventory miscalculations, the kind of gradual erosion that doesn't announce itself dramatically all at once, but slowly compounds over time. That phone call from my mother, roughly 6 months after I left, came during a period when, from what she explained, the restaurant had started falling noticeably behind on some of its financial obligations, struggling in ways it hadn't during the years I had been managing those particular responsibilities so closely. I didn't think anything of it beyond the ordinary business of an elderly woman getting her affairs in order, which, of course, made perfect sense given her declining health. I certainly never imagined those visits had anything to do with me. Why would they? I was the maid. A well-compensated, deeply appreciated maid, perhaps, but a maid nonetheless in the eyes of everyone else in that family. It genuinely never crossed my mind that Eleanor Whitfield was quietly rewriting the entire future of her estate, and that I was somewhere in the center of those changes. Eleanor passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring, peacefully, in her sleep, in the very bed I had helped her into countless nights before. I was the one who found her. I was the one who called the ambulance, though I already knew in my heart there was nothing left to be done. I was the one who sat beside her for nearly 20 minutes before I could bring myself to make the second phone call, the one to her children, because once I made that call, it would become real in a way I wasn't ready for. The funeral was, in many ways, exactly what you'd expect from a family like the Whitfields. Elegant, expensive, somewhat hollow. Richard gave a eulogy that sounded more like a corporate retirement speech than a tribute to his mother, full of accomplishments and legacy and very little actual love. Patricia cried, though I couldn't help but notice she checked her phone twice during the service. Daniel stood quietly at the back, and for a moment, just a brief moment, I saw something genuine in his face, a flicker of real grief that made me think, perhaps, he wasn't entirely lost to the coldness that seemed to run through the rest of the family. I stood near the back of the church, too, dressed in the only black dress I owned, feeling like an outsider at the funeral of a woman who had been closer to me than my own mother in those final years. Nobody acknowledged me. Nobody thanked me for the 11 years I had spent caring for their mother, for the nights I stayed awake listening for her call, for the meals, the medications, the quiet companionship that filled the loneliest hours of her life. I understood in that moment that I would likely never see this family again once the arrangements were settled. I assumed my role in their lives, and Eleanor's, had ended with her final breath. I was wrong. About 2 weeks after the funeral, I received a phone call from Mr. Coleman, the attorney I had seen visiting Eleanor during those final months. He informed me that the reading of the will was scheduled for the following Friday at his office downtown, and that my presence was required. I remember standing in my small kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, genuinely confused. "I think there's been some mistake," I told him. "I'm not family. I was just her caregiver." There was a brief pause on the line before he replied, his voice calm and certain. "Mrs. Whitfield was very specific about who needed to be present, and your name was on that list. I'd strongly encourage you to attend." I spent the days leading up to that Friday in a strange state of anxiety I couldn't fully explain. Some small part of me wondered if Eleanor had left me a modest gift, perhaps a piece of jewelry or a small sum of money as a thank you for my years of service. I told myself not to expect anything, that showing up was simply a formality, perhaps something related to final payroll or a reference letter. I had no idea, none whatsoever, of what was actually waiting for me in that office. The morning of the reading, I dressed carefully, still uncertain of what role I was supposed to play in a room full of people who had spent over a decade treating me as though I were part of the wallpaper. When I arrived at Coleman's office, a sleek, quiet space with dark wood paneling and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, Richard, Patricia, and Daniel were already seated around a long conference table. The moment I walked in, I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, and not with warmth. "What is she doing here?" Patricia asked, not even bothering to lower her voice, as though I couldn't hear her from 3 feet away. Richard glanced at his watch, visibly irritated, muttering something about how this was supposed to be a family matter. Only Daniel offered a small, polite nod in my direction, though even he looked confused by my presence. I took the seat Mr. Coleman gestured toward, at the far end of the table, feeling smaller than I had in years, wondering if I had made some terrible mistake by coming at all. Mr. Coleman opened a leather folder, cleared his throat, and began reading through the will with the practiced calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. The first portion was fairly predictable. The house itself, along with the majority of Eleanor's remaining liquid assets, was to be divided among her 3 children, though not in equal shares, something that visibly irritated Richard the moment he heard Patricia was receiving a slightly larger portion due to what the will described as her more consistent presence in my final years, a claim I personally found somewhat generous given what I had witnessed. But I said nothing. Then Mr. Coleman paused, adjusted his glasses, and looked directly at me. The room went completely silent. "There is a specific bequest," he said slowly, "left to a person named in this document as a member of this family in every way that matters, though not by blood." He read my full name aloud. I remember my heart stopping in my chest, the sound of my own pulse suddenly deafening in my ears, as 3 pairs of stunned eyes turned to stare at me from across that long table. What Eleanor had left me was not a small gift. It was not a token of appreciation meant to soothe a guilty conscience or fulfill some minor obligation. She had left me the lake house, a property just outside the city that had belonged to her own mother, a place she had told me during one of our late-night conversations was the only home that had ever truly felt like hers growing up. Alongside the property, she had left a sum of money substantial enough to change the entire trajectory of my life, along with a letter, sealed, addressed to me personally, which Mr. Coleman handed across the table with a gentleness I hadn't expected from a room that had suddenly grown very cold. The reaction from Eleanor's children was immediate and, in hindsight, entirely predictable. Richard stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled backward, demanding to know how the housekeeper could possibly be entitled to a piece of family property that had been passed down for 3 generations. Patricia's face had gone pale, then flushed with anger, insisting there must have been some manipulation involved, some undue influence exerted on a vulnerable elderly woman. Only Daniel remained quiet, staring down at the table, his jaw tight, saying nothing at all, though I couldn't tell if his silence came from shock or from something closer to shame. Mr. Coleman, to his credit, remained entirely unmoved by the outburst. He explained, calmly and clearly, that Eleanor had been of sound mind when she made these changes, that he had personally overseen multiple consultations to ensure there was no question of her mental competency, and that she had, in fact, written the letter I now held specifically to address exactly this kind of reaction. He suggested, gently but firmly, that everyone take a moment to allow me to read it before any further discussion took place. My hands were shaking as I broke the seal on that envelope. Eleanor's handwriting, familiar to me from years of grocery lists and small notes left on the kitchen counter, filled 2 pages, front and back. I won't share every word of that letter, because some things are simply too personal, too private, to hand over entirely, even in a story like this one. But I will tell you what mattered most. She wrote that in the final years of her life, when her own children treated visits like obligations and phone calls like chores to check off a list, I was the one constant source of genuine care she experienced. She wrote that love, real love, isn't measured in shared blood or shared last names, but in shared time, shared patience, and the willingness to sit with someone through their hardest, loneliest hours without expecting anything in return. She wrote that the lake house had always represented to her a place untouched by the transactional coldness that had crept into so much of her life, and that she couldn't imagine leaving it to anyone who hadn't shown her that same kind of untouched, unconditional care. She wrote that she hoped, more than anything, that her children would eventually come to understand what she had come to understand herself, far too late in life. That true family isn't defined by inheritance or bloodline, but by who chooses to show up again and again without condition. By the time I finished reading, I was crying openly at that table, and I noticed, through blurred vision, that Daniel's eyes had welled up too, though he quickly wiped them away and looked toward the window instead. Richard and Patricia, however, remained furious, and the following weeks brought threats of legal challenges, accusations of manipulation, and a level of hostility I genuinely hadn't expected, even from people who had never particularly liked me. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I've always wondered how others would feel in this exact situation. If you had spent over a decade caring for someone who eventually became more like family than your actual relatives, would you have expected anything in return? Or would simply having been trusted with those final years have felt like enough? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments below, because I think the answer says a lot about how we each define what family really means. In the end, the legal challenge Richard and Patricia attempted never gained any real traction. Mr. Coleman had been thorough, meticulous even, in documenting Eleanor's mental clarity throughout the process of updating her will, including a formal evaluation from an independent physician specifically requested to preempt exactly this kind of dispute. Within a few months, the challenge was quietly dropped, though the relationship between myself and Eleanor's 2 eldest children never recovered, and honestly, I've made peace with that. Some bridges, once burned by years of quiet disrespect, simply aren't meant to be rebuilt. Daniel, interestingly, reached out to me about 6 months after the reading of the will. We met for coffee, somewhat awkwardly at first, though the conversation eventually opened into something more honest than I expected. He admitted, with what seemed like genuine remorse, that he had spent years assuming his mother's needs were being adequately met, simply because she never openly complained, and that he had never stopped to consider what her day-to-day life actually looked like. Who was actually present for the small, unglamorous moments that make up a life? He thanked me, sincerely, for the care I had given his mother when he hadn't been present to give it himself. It wasn't a perfect resolution, and it certainly didn't erase over a decade of being treated as invisible, but it felt, in its own small way, like a genuine step toward understanding. I still visit the lake house every summer. I've kept it largely as Eleanor left it, the same worn wooden dock stretching out over the water, the same faded quilt folded at the foot of the guest bed, the same collection of mystery novels lining the bookshelf in the small study overlooking the lake. Sometimes, in the quiet of those early mornings, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise off the water, I think about how strange it is that a woman who once told me I was the only person who sat with her because I wanted to, not because I needed something, ended up changing the entire course of my life simply by choosing, in her final act, to see me clearly when almost everyone else in her orbit had chosen not to. If this story moved you even a little, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it today. Maybe someone who feels overlooked in their own life. Someone who wonders if quiet, consistent kindness actually matters in the end. Because it does. It always does, even when it feels like nobody's watching. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I'll see you in the next story.